Welcome once again to the next episode of our series on the man and the god that is Tiber Septim. Last time we discussed his ascension to the Ruby Throne and what may or may not have transpired. Tales of heroism and murder. But today we will be talking about just how it was that Tiber Septim took the armies of his empire from Cyrodiil to conquer the rest of Tamriel. Now, unlike the previous video, there is likely to be far less in the way of discussing the Arcturian heresy. Whilst it is influential here, that is mainly due to factors that are better saved for the next video. But laying out the story as best we can here will be crucial to understanding the greater picture. With that all said, be sure to subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content, and let's get started. Now, as we learned last time, the armies of Skyrim were largely under the Empire already due to what happened at Sacred Tor. This causes the Jarls of Skyrim to very quickly follow suit, but this would be by far the easiest part of Septim's plans. Remember, he no longer has the power of his Thu'um to rely on, and so commands his forces from the Imperial Palace. Next up for the human-ruled lands was High Rock. We once again learned in the last episode that at the same battle, the Bretons who had allied themselves with the Nords were far less happy with the outcome. Those who did not flee were executed, imprisoned, or sold as slaves, though I can't find any reference as to who they were sold to. Regardless, High Rock needed to fall, and to do that, the Emperor sent his fleets for a surprise attack on the navy stationed at Wayrest. Thanks to the distinguishing efforts of one Emil Richten, the battle would be won decisively, and he would soon take the rank of Admiral. Now, with a foothold in High Rock, attention was turned to quelling rebellion and ensuring naval superiority at the southern border to ward off potential attack from the Aldmeri Dominion, whilst also preparing their forces for the most difficult conquest yet, Hammerfell. But the Emperor was not one to attempt annexation without a plan. Two main Redguard factions were entrenched in civil war after the death of their High King. The Empire extended an offer of support to the more cosmopolitan forebears of aid against the traditional and loyalist Crown faction. In return for the Empire's aid, they would be granted territory. This would culminate in the Battle of Stros M'Kai. Here, the esteemed Admiral Richten would once again lead the Empire's forces. But Tiber Septim wasn't leaving anything to chance against such a stalwart foe. He had a secret weapon, the dragon Nephalalagus. Yes, Tiber Septim had himself a great red dragon, and a fiercely loyal one at that. He had only survived so long by making pacts with mortals after all, but regardless of the reason for his allegiance, be it preservation or gold, the Nephalalagus would torch the Crown's flagship, killing their leader. This would ensure victory over the Crowns, and the newly acquired territory would be used to further force the Empire into Hammerfell. After years of occupation and expansion, Hammerfell would eventually fall entirely under the Empire's banner. Meanwhile, down in Elseweyr, the Emperor was about to have an even bigger potential threat to his power. Whilst the physical conquest was far easier there was one thing martial prowess couldn't save him from: political outrage. In the early days spent invading Elseweyr, a member of the 3rd Legion, who we will surely return to later, called Atribus, claims to have personally, during the sacking of Senchal, killed 30 Khajiit for his emperor. And not just the men, but the women, and the children too. This incident was so bad that it was removed from all Imperial records to prevent the horrific backlash it could have caused among the public. But regardless, the 3rd Legion is undoubtedly one of the most revered legions of its time due to its swift actions in dealing with the uprisings back in Anvil in Cyrodiil. But back to Elseweyr, the province, whilst providing minimal resistance to actually being taken over, continued to rebel against the Empire. Despite this, however, its control was stable enough to declare the land of the Khajiit under the banner of the Septim Empire. In many ways, Black Marsh was the biggest failure of the Tiber Wars, though whether it was really important is up for debate. In the aftermath of the Khanatan flu, and with the knowledge of the many other diseases and general uninhabitableness of the inner province, only the border areas were ever truly conquered, with the Emperor not wishing to enter further and the Argonians wishing the same, forming a kind of unofficial truce. Speaking of diplomacy, we finally come to Morrowind. Morrowind during this time was of course ruled over by the living gods of the Tribunal, Vivec, Almalexia, and Sothosil. Initially, the Emperor wasn't going to attempt invasion at all, but it was said he was pushed to by certain advisors. Eventually, he realized he could attempt to exploit the infighting of the great houses, and so he got to work. But he needn't have strategized so hard. You see, Septim's invasion of Morrowind took place at an incredibly convenient time for him. Dagoth had only recently returned and cut off the source of the Tribunal of God's power. This made them vulnerable, and therefore willing to negotiate. In exchange for the rich supplies of ebony and occupation of Morrowind, the Empire would allow all traditional customs, including religious worship and slavery, to continue. Vivec even gifted Tiber Septim the Dwemer's great brass god, the Numidium. And in one of his best moves, he also ensured that no non-Dunmer could have the Assassination Guild of the Morag Tong used against them, which, considering their track record of killing emperors, was a wise move. Now, one of the more interesting things that happened during the first few initial conflicts the Empire and Dunmer had was the sacking of Mournhold. This is where Tiber Septim first came across Baron Zaya, who would become the first queen of Morrowind and first imperial vassal ruler. But her story is one for another video, so we shall leave the conquered state of Morrowind here. Next up was the Aldmeri Dominion of Valenwood and Somerset. And of course, it's Valenwood first. Valenwood at this time was under the control of a mix of Aldmeri government and its own tribal leaders, and was more stable than it had been in recent memory, despite being unpopular. And this government was collectively called the Thalmor. Now, you'll be pleased to hear that Tiber Septim absolutely demolished them. The sheer force of his armies crushed any resistance. But to minimize rebellion, the Emperor decided to mostly leave them to their own devices, allowing them to keep their tribal leaders and even to continue the line of Cameron kings. This left only one obstacle for Tiber Septim to overcome in his conquest of Tamriel, the Somerset Isles. As his armies came ever closer to the Elven Isles, it would mean the end for the majority of the Third Legion, taken by surprise at Black Rocks. But as all this happens, Tiber Septim was able to reactivate the Numidium he received from Vivec, and it was said he used it to subjugate all of Somerset in 1 hour. But this information is from an unofficial source, and we'll talk more about those in another video. Regardless, the Numidium was used to subjugate the High Elves, and was then turned to forcefully placing trusted families of Tiber Septim into positions of power across Tamriel. But, one way or another, it was soon destroyed. But those events will also need to be covered next time. But regardless of the fate of the Numidium, Tiber Septim had finally achieved what no other had, or to this day ever would. The more or less complete unification of Tamriel under the banner of the Empire. And that is all for today. Next time, we will be looking into two very important pieces of the puzzle of Tiber Septim's life: Zuran Arctus and the enigmatic, seemingly unstoppable puppet master that is the Underking. So, be sure to subscribe as to not miss that one, and I will see you next time.